Okay, I want to thank everybody for tuning into this program. Tonight we have two special guests. They were here a few weeks ago. We talked about postponement. We talked about full preterism. We talked about dispensationalism. It was a really great discussion, had a lot of interaction, had a lot of hits, had a lot of feedback on that discussion. Tonight I want to welcome them back again. We've got SoCal Preston over here. He's no stranger to this channel. He's got a wonderful debate ministry going on. Also have Jeremy from New Heaven and New Earth Unveiled. He's got a very popular YouTube channel. And I want to welcome both gentlemen to the program. How are you guys?
Doing well, gentlemen.
Doing great. Strong intro there, feeling. Loved it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I got to get us motivated. He's got all these, pansy sort of.
I know. I was rocking out.
So we got to get.
Yeah, I feel like grabbing one of my guitars here and rocking out.
Well, anyways, I wanted to thank both of you guys for coming to the show. I guess tonight we're going to be talking about the challenge of Paul's epistles, because Jeremy, you did a show, I think it was last week, or might have been a couple of weeks ago. I know you did one last week, but you had been talking about the differences in Paul's epistles, differences between his early epistles and his later epistles. I think this is really one of the pieces of evidence that Christians leave out of the equation is when they just lump everything together. And you brought this out. I know, Dave, you believe that this is related to, I think the offering of the kingdom to Israel. So you're kind of on the same page as with me, and we get our perspective more from Bullinger's approach. But I also, Jeremy, when you weighed in the other day, you said, can we have someone else here, maybe give another another position. And I couldn't think of anybody that really knew anything about this. And so I figured, well, maybe we should just keep it amongst ourselves. But I did send you a clip from another book, from a preterist book, where Alford and Olshausen, two respected, very conservative commentators, were talking about the same thing. So the point I wanted to bring out was this isn't just a dispensational thing. This isn't just something that was cooked up by Bullinger, to get around a past, coming of Jesus Christ. This is something that other scholars who weren't even dispensational have already seen. And so I think it's gotten pushed under the carpet in recent years, but I'm just going to open it up, I guess, to you first, Jeremy, and you could hit the floor, and then we'll bring it back to SoCal so that you guys could just give your insight. What do you think about this? Do you think it's got any merit to it, or do you think we're just chasing a red herring?
So I think it's very important. And what happened with me? So you were the first one, Brian, that pointed this out to me, and it was a comment on one of my YouTube videos, and it really intrigued me because I had never heard anyone say it before. So immediately I read your book, and I read how you lay everything out, and I was really intrigued by it. It was one of those things, I think, that I think what everyone, and I've been noticing what I did back then is what everyone does when I bring it up to them now. And I tried to find some people to come on as well, and they said they would like to come on, but they don't really know enough about it. So you're right, it is hard to just find someone who's aware of this. And so what I did is I just kind of pushed it aside and said, well, it's interesting, but I don't know what to do with that, and moved on. And then as the years went by here, and we're getting into all these debates and different views that you've had on your channel and that I've talked about on my channel, I said, I really have to try to figure this out. So went back to your book, and you lay it out in your book very nicely. But I said, I need to just read all of Paul's epistles and see if this is true, and try to do my best to find out the timeline, because the timeline would be important to figure this out. And so I looked everywhere to find out, where can I get a chronology of the New Testament? And man, it's tough, because you'll find all different types of chronologies. They don't agree with each other. The best that I could find is the scholarly consensus on Paul's, what they call his 7 undisputed letters. Now, whether you agree with that or not, the significance of the undisputed 7 is they're all pre-70 AD epistles. And that's what even, critical scholars agree. So I said, okay, let me start there with the 7 that everyone agrees on are before 70. And you'll find common themes in those 7. And then what you start to see when you get past those 7, you start to see things change not only with the imminency, but with I've been saying this a lot on my channel, but the already but not yet. What I mean by that is salvation was expected. The completeness of salvation was expected at the second coming, at the parousia. That was the expectation for the total fulfillment of the kingdom of resurrection. But what happens when you get past, and I'm not saying it's not there in the seven. If people know what I'm talking about, the undisputed seven, I'll just kind of I'll rattle them off here real quick. So it would be 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon. So, the first thing everyone has to understand is, well, why is there imminency in the New Testament? Why is there imminency in Paul's early letters? So Paul's writing, most would agree, 20 years past the cross. And so we understand from, I think 1 Corinthians 15 is really where we have to go to understand this whole timeline, this whole, how this all works in Paul's teaching. So Paul believes that Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection, and there's an order to the resurrection, that it's Christ the first fruits, then those who are at his coming. And then after all that happens, God is all in all. We know the passages. That's the end. And so that's why there's imminency, because if it's a first fruit, if Christ is the first fruits, then the rest of the harvest should be right around the corner, because you just take Feast of First Fruits, right? It's an offering. It's not only in Judaism, it's also in Greek culture and in the ancient world. First fruits of the harvest. The first fruits of the harvest was offered, if you're in Judaism, to the God of Israel, and other cultures, maybe whatever God they have. And then the harvest is right around the corner. Well, if it's been 20 years and the resurrection hasn't happened, it's already been a long time. It's kind of hard for us to think that way, but it would have been in Paul's mind, because people are already denying that there's going to be a resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. I think that's why. I think it's been a long time. So that, for me, that's kind of the biggest point. Is we can talk, you guys know more about this than I do, but if I would have my biggest takeaway to this imminency, how it goes from imminent to being a little more delayed and off in the future, like in the pastorals, where it almost seems like the last days are now in the future. In the last days, right? This will happen. But Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, he's saying the end of the ages have come upon us. So there's a difference there. But the big one for me is just this whole already but not yet. Because in 1 Corinthians 15, he says God will be all in all when, right? After destroying, I'll just read real quick. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father. After destroying every rule, every authority and power, he must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. There's Paul's millennium, the reigning until all enemies are under his feet. And the last enemy destroyed is death. For God has put all things in subjection under his feet. But when it says all things are put in subjection, it is plain that he is accepted who put all things in subjection under him. When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will be subjected to him, who put all things in subjection under him, that God may be all in all. So when God is all in all in 1 Corinthians 15, it's when all is fulfilled. It's when the second coming, the resurrection, everything is fulfilled. But then you get to Colossians in 3:11. It says, here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave free, but Christ is all in all. And then in Ephesians is a really good example of how the already but not yet has come to the point to where you've already been raised up and seated with Christ in the heavenly places, right? There, so some type of resurrection has already happened, but they still see it future. And so I think what the error and what a full preterist and what I believe is, we're using these passages like we've been raised up, right? But that's not what the author wouldn't be a full preterist. The author would say, Paul would say, you've been raised up, but there's still something future. That's just the thing. These are all the passages in the Bible are pre-consummation. Okay. So I'll just read this and I'll turn to you guys real quick. So in Ephesians 4:6-13, this really comes out about God being all in all right now. It says, one God and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. But grace was given to each of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore, it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. In saying he ascended, what does it mean but that he also descended into the lower regions of the earth? right? That's in the Apostles' Creed. That's in the creed we say at the church every Sunday. He who descended is the one who also ascended for above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ until we attain to the unity of the faith, the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So he's saying God is all in all now. And there's going to be this time of building up the body of Christ. Well, that's not Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. He's not even addressing a church. He's addressing the believers, right? And God will be all in all when the resurrection, when Jesus returns. But here, it seems like what's happening is it's setting up for a long period of time, right? And the church has existed for a long period of time. Okay, we've been okay existing for a long period of time because we have these passages to how do we live now? And so when you say it's all fulfilled, you would say, well, what do we do? But Ephesians is telling us right here. So I don't know. I went a little long there, but I just, that's pretty much the main part of what I've got from all this.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that perspective, and I'll agree with a lot of that. What do you think, SoCal? I know you've studied this in depth as well. What do you think about this difference? Is there really a difference? Are we making this up, or are we over-exaggerating this distinction between Paul's earlier epistles and his later epistles, or is there something to this?
There's definitely something to this, and I would like to give me a second. I would like to recommend that everybody read this book, The Forgotten Truths by Sir Robert Anderson. By the way, Phelan, have you ever read this yet? I know you know who Sir Robert Anderson is.
I haven't read it, no.
Okay, it's an easy, short read, but I wanna open up real quick with at least what I have to say with his preface, a little excerpt from his preface, and it relates to what you're saying, Jeremy. So on page within his preface, 13, page 13. And I'm going to skip down a little. He says this, and when in amazement we seek for some explanation of the words. And by the way, everybody, this book was written well over 100 years ago. And Sir Robert Anderson was a classical dispensationalist. He was very influential dispensationalist. He was companions with men like C.I. Scofield and even E.W. Bullinger. He was also, as I said, he's a sir. He was actually knighted by Queen Victoria. And he was also on the Scotland Yard and trivia. He, I believe, was involved in the hunt for Jack the Ripper. So he was an investigator first, and then a Bible student second. Or he probably would say, no, I'm a Bible student first, and I'm an investigator second. But in his book, Forgotten Truths, which is a very, very great book and a must read, he says this in his preface. And when in amazement we seek for some explanation of the words, quote, surely I come quickly, unquote, we are told that with the Lord, 1,000 years are as one day, 2 Peter 3:8. And he says, but does anyone really imagine that there is a celestial timepiece with a 1,000-year dial? Is it not clear as light from the language of these and kindred scriptures, such as Psalms 90, verse 4, that eternity is God's domain? Therefore, is it that his judgments are unsearchable and his ways past finding out? For eternity is not limited time. For eternity is not unlimited time, but the antithesis of time, whereas time is the law of our being. And he's quoting from Trent's synonyms, the condition under which all created things exist. Those who put a special meaning on certain words in gospel texts can plead with truth that these words are sometimes used in a restrictive sense. But no plea of this kind is tenable here. I am surely coming quickly. Yet a very little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. These words are too definite to admit of any second meaning, and to refuse to take them literally is equivalent to challenging their truth. But how then can we explain the fact that they are still unfulfilled? A solution of that most perplexing difficulty is supplied by the following pages. Robert Anderson. So with that, I highly recommend that you read this book, because he goes in great detail into a lot of the questions that I think that we're going to ask tonight. But you really get a good perspective I think from his book. Now, to take a step back and really try to figure out what if anything is to this idea that Paul's earlier epistles seem to have a different tone, they seem to have, as you travel through his later epistles, the tone seems to change in such a way that imminency is somewhat not as expressed as in some of the earlier epistles. Well, first things first, I think we always need to try to put make sure we go back and put ourselves in their shoes. We need to really try to avoid being narcissist and narcissist, and we need to make sure that we are truly interpreting the scripture properly. And one way to do that is to definitely go back and understand the sits and Leben, how the living setting was, what were they thinking during their time. Now, well, Paul, when you read his letters in our Bible, we don't have the letters lined up in chronological order. So I think that's kind of where some difficulty lies. But still, I think what happens is if you were to do just straight from Romans to what I believe Hebrews was written by Paul, all the way to Hebrews, I could see how someone might not fully get what we're trying to say. But I could see also, though, how a lot of people will start to see, okay, there looks like a different author. And usually those persuasions are those from, like, let's just say, who are more the academic, not so, like, don't believe in the miracles. And I'm not saying Jeremy or you or anyone else out there is like that. But the reality is a lot of scholars out there, I would call them, that aren't necessarily believing in things that we believe traditionally. They would see this more, the easy explanation is, one, it's just a different author, or two, it's just failed. And that's something we have to also address, because people are seeing it. Okay, so there are people outside of Christianity that do see a difference. They do. So that's something that people need to understand. Now, the other thing too that I think is important to realize, when we go back and we study the culture setting, the sits and Leben, I find it very helpful when we just let the text speak for itself rather than input our religious political beliefs within it. Because here's the thing: if we do look at Paul and we do look at his early epistles, let's just say we could agree on Romans, for example, Romans being, or Corinthians, or Thessalonians for sure. Okay, we look at some of his early epistles, we see clearly that, as I quoted earlier from John, or from book Revelation, what John said, surely I come quickly, what he said about Christ, it's clearly evident that it's all about now in their time. When you look at the suffering they were going through, when you read the message that Paul was delivering, it was as if, like, hey, get ready. You are going to suffer. You are going to potentially even die for Christ. But fear not, because you will take part in the better resurrection. So I think what happens is you have Paul expressing that imminency all the way even till the end, his last epistles, not as much as his early epistles, but in his ending epistles, specifically those that are prison epistles, we would call, that we, or I think even Sir Robert Anderson says captivity epistles, which I found that was interesting. But we see that Paul creates more of an option of where setting up the church. I think, Jerry, you mentioned this, deacons, elders, those are things like, versus earlier epistles was like, hey, what's the point of marriage? Really putting a point on, like, hey, the here and now is only going to last for not much longer. So what I see, just to summarize, is I see Paul's earlier epistles clearly expressing some sort of direct or immediate return of Christ within their time, within that time frame, not 2,000 years later. And then I see, as Paul gets closer to the end, pre the fall of the temple, I do see, just like Peter, and to Peter, I do see a change in tone, in that essentially they're still waiting the parousia, they're still waiting the coming of the Lord, but it seems as if now it's like, hey, look, at this point, here's the structure we're going to go by, and I'm off now to be slain. So that's what I see. What the issue is, though, is I see one, there are people outside of, we would say, of traditional Christianity that would say there's multiple authors. That's why you're seeing what you're seeing. Or there's others that are saying it's a fulfilled prophecy. Or there's others that are saying no, it's everything was fulfilled in 70 AD, and we have to jam it all in there. And you just can't do that.
Yeah. And that was the problem I came across, after I left full preterism and I started looking into this. Well, when I discovered Bullinger and I started reading his take on this, I said, regardless of whether we're preterist or whether we're futurist, we all think that Paul was talking about some things that would apply beyond AD 70 because we're all applying texts to ourselves. Like I said in a previous podcast, we're basically, taking 2,000-year-old Jewish writings and applying them to ourselves. That's basically what we're doing. And so in order to do that, there has to be some applicability. And so we create these, these terminus markers in our theological systems where we say, okay, well, this point, it ended right here, and then this began. And so full preterism will say, well, this is where everything ends as far as fulfillment goes. But the fact of the matter is, even if you're a full preterist, you're still taking texts that belonged to this pre-consummative period, and you're still applying it to the present period we're in now, to the age of post-consummation. So you still at least tentatively agree that certain things were going to go past AD 70, that we still need to preach the gospel, we still need to keep Christ's commandments or what have you. We still need to, set up churches. We still need to have preaching of the gospel. And so I find it to be a little bit disconcerting when someone says, well, it's all been fulfilled. And then when you start, digging a little bit deeper and finding out, well, why they believe that, you're going to come to a point where, now the goalposts start to shift. It's like, oh, well, this only applied to them. And then you say, okay, well, then you give them a text, you shoot a text back at them, and they're like, oh, no, that was just, but then they apply text to themselves. So it's like, well, why is it, what are we doing here? Are we just, playing games with the text? Or why are we being so arbitrary? And so I was thinking about this. I'm going to hand it back to you in a minute, Jeremy, but I was thinking about, ways that people handle massive conflicting data. And there's just a few ways that people react to this. So the first way is, when you come across a mass of all this conflicting data, it would be, you'll throw your hands up and say, this is so confusing. We're never going to figure it out. It's kind of like the approach I think that you're taking, Jeremy, where you're saying, look, I'm remaining neutral because this is such, there's so much data out there that there's so many different opinions, etc. Let me just remain neutral till this all gets sorted out. And then there's another way that says, well, everybody's confused, look at all the confusion, and therefore here's my solution. So it's posit a new solution. That's sort of like the Doug King approach, where he's always pointing at, look at all the confusion in Christianity. Then he comes along and creates a new system and says, therefore, this is my system, guys. This must be the truth, or it could be just throwing another view in the pot. And then there's the third way, which is my way, which is to look at the data and say, hey, look, everybody has some things right and some things wrong. And so our business is to, determine who's right about what and who's wrong, and then to take the truth from that and to appropriate it and then to throw out the error. And of course, this is always going to be the harder way because it takes a lot of time, and it takes also a power of discrimination to discriminate between fact and fiction. And, humans, we like to generalize because when we generalize, we could deal with data in batches, right? We could batch process information. And so, one of the problems I have with amillennialism is they try to batch process all the texts that talk of the resurrection when you've got, when you come to the very end of Revelation, you have a text which says, well, it's 1,000 years, there's a resurrection, first resurrection, then you have another resurrection after 1,000 years. Now that just may be a one-off, but then you dig deeper and you say, you come across, phrases in the Greek that indicate that maybe there's a selection of some prior to others. You batch process these, you always end up losing data. And so I think, well, of course, that the easiest way, the way that's most common, is someone just takes a view that they like and then they dig their heels in the dirt, basically. I mean, I like vanilla floats, but that doesn't mean that there's no other no other option that's just as feasible. So I'm gonna hand it back to you, Jeremy, but I think we're at this stage right now where we're not just looking at data, because I don't think personally that this is a gotcha argument. I've never treated this. And, my book, which is I like to call it a pamphlet rather than a book, because it's not really a book, but yeah, I never use it really as a gotcha argument. What I'm saying is it helps to create a reasonable doubt. It adds to a body of evidence, of cumulative evidence, which I think helps create a reasonable doubt. Now, reasonable doubt, according to the laws of evidence, is, if you're going to prove something in court, you have to prove it right beyond a reasonable doubt. So a reasonable doubt, to me, if you can create a reasonable doubt, and that's not necessarily what I'm trying to do, but I'm looking at all this data that's coming in, and some of the data is just, I have to put it on the other side of the scale. And I have a reasonable doubt as to everything being fulfilled in AD 70 now. Were some things fulfilled in AD 70? Absolutely. I've already said, I believe there's a good, preterists have a good, they're on a path. Okay. They're definitely on a path headed towards something. But I think when they start trying to tie everything into AD 70, I think that's when we run into a problem. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, and just like you said, I'm taking this neutral approach, which I'll tell you where I came up with the whole idea of a neutral approach. So I was on this Facebook page, and if you want to go to, it's called Preterist Perspectives. I think you're the one who turned me on to it, Brian. You were over there for a little bit. You're muted. I can't hear you.
Yeah. I don't remember. Preterist Perspectives.
Preterist Perspectives, Discussion and Debate. I think.
Oh yeah, it was Facebook forum.
Yeah, Facebook forum. And if anyone wants to go on over there and see kind of where full preterism eventually takes people, you can see it there. It's a lot of IO. It's a lot of people who no longer believe. They no longer believe in it's atheistic stuff, and Barry Isaacs is one of the moderators over there, and he said, though, on the one post, he said, I'm officially declaring myself neutral, because you could tell he was, he still believes, but he's just not sure about how to put this whole thing together, because he sees problems with full preterism, he sees problems with futurism, and when I read that, I didn't even share this with anybody yet, but I just want to explain why I'm this way, because someone sent me an email today and got me thinking. And I said, you know what? At the time I was frustrated with everything, and he actually mentioned you, Brian. He said that maybe maybe Phil McPhail's delayed. Maybe that's the only way to work this out. And I said, well, wow, I'm coming like full circle now, because look, I'll admit, me being neutral and saying the things I'm saying now and making the video it was all it was to keep me from going the route of where people go, like a myth vision, because in my mind I was almost there. I couldn't let myself go there because I have such a strong faith. But when I was looking at the scriptures purely from an intellectual point of view, so that's the thing. And SoCal, you said in your debate, you said faith has got to be a part of that. And so I had conversations with my pastor in the basement, and he knew I was full preterist. I was into I even tried to show him the universalist thing, and he kind of just like was patient with me, and you could tell he didn't quite agree. But I am okay having these problems, having these discussions down in the basement of the church, and then going up there for worship and seeing people that need help and helping them, and seeing Christ. So what I see in my life is I see the Spirit of Christ at work in the church, and I see that's the most important thing to me. So I think what's cool about what we're doing here is we can take the intellectual part, but not go too far with it, right? We still want to say the scriptures are inspired, but we still want to we don't want to ignore the intellectual side. We don't want to just say, well, all these scholars just don't know what they're talking about, because look, they know what they're talking about. They've spent enough time studying them. They see these differences because they are there. I mean, I saw Michael on the chat there saying we made this up, right? I mean, just read it, like, it's there. You can't deny it's there. So the thing is, because I'll tell you, Jeff Cunningham sent me an email, and he picked up on this. He picked up on some of the things I'm saying, and he said, hey, I just watched this Myth Vision show. Are you kind of going that way with your agnostic approach to eschatology? He's like, well, I know you won't because of your life-changing and all that stuff. And so that's the thing. So I think that there should be a balance between the intellectual side and we have to have faith. And I do, for me, worship and church. So I think that in a way, it's the Holy Spirit with the church that continues this and pushes this thing on. I think the world would be in big trouble without the church. And I tried to take full preterism to its full conclusion, which became, Max King's universalism. I tried to make that work, and I think he makes a lot of good points. But some of the things, the directions it takes you, is we don't need church anymore. We don't need to be Christian anymore. And for me, that would be going backwards, right? Going into, all religions or whatever, Buddhism, whatever. That's the stuff I was into before my life was radically changed. So for me, this kind of new agey, whatever you want to call it, idea that some of this stuff takes you to in full preterism, for me, it'd be going backwards. Like, Christ is the only one that's ever done anything for my life. I was praying that I was into the new age stuff and nothing. And when I prayed to Christ and I repented and I called the name of the Lord, that's when everything changed. So I feel there's a barrier, and I feel like we just can't cross that barrier. And that's the danger of what full preterism does. And I sent this out to you guys, but I'm going to read it real quick. I got a comment on my my last video. It was somebody. It was somebody that basically said they've been a Christian all their lives, and 20, 25 years Christian or whatever. They were a Calvinist, and when the whole Gary DeMar thing happened, they got into full preterism, and now they see their faith going away. They don't know what to do, right? I don't know if I should do this, do that. I'll pull. I'll while you guys are talking, I'll pull up and read at the end. But even when I was on Michael Miano show, and he was talking about how they change. I don't want to call him out or anything, but I just want to give an example of what crossing the boundary does, right? He said, well, we changed the Lord's Prayer at our church, right? Like, he changed it in a way to say that he has come or something like that. And I even, at that point, I was like, I felt really bad about it because I was going to church this whole time. But I think with these, I want to stay on point with the earlier and the later. And so okay, you brought up a good point, SoCal. Critical scholars say, well, because of these differences, maybe someone else wrote it. Well, the thing is, we don't know when Paul died. We don't have any verifiable evidence. We don't know. But the other thing is, take 2 Peter 3, for example, which I do believe that was not written by Peter. But so does that make it not inspired? I don't think so. I think the Spirit can work with the church to reveal things past 70 AD. And I think what a text like 2 Peter does, or what these later epistles do, is regardless of who wrote it, we can understand what the church thought at the time. We can understand what early Christians thought. And so I think this is what early Christians believed, that the temple fell, but there was a time period that didn't fulfill everything, and not everything was fulfilled because of the temple falling. And so I think what we can see, and so me saying that is consistent with everything in Christianity, right? It's consistent with church fathers. It's consistent with all that stuff, that 70 AD and no early Christian's mind meant that all was fulfilled. Because if all was fulfilled, we don't have, here's the thing, if all is fulfilled, we don't have any instruction of how to live in the Bible, because it's all pre-consummated text. So if it all is fulfilled, we can't go to the scriptures to see how are we going to live and how are we going to do, and that's when people go into IO and go into atheism, because they say, and Tristan brought it out, Man, he really brought it out, man. He's, you know, in his charismatic, you know, humorous way, you know, he did a video on this, and he always said preterists use 1% of scripture to justify how we're to live now. And I almost think it's 0%. Because, and I went through that on Revelation. I think that all these texts, I think the reason why all their pre-consummate, because I think, you know, when the consummation would happen, there wouldn't be any argument, there wouldn't be any more debate, there wouldn't be any male or female. The form of the world would pass away. There wouldn't be marriage and giving in marriage. We would be like the angels in heaven. I think that there was a big change that was to come. And so we look at the history, and nothing really changed after the fall of the temple. In fact, things got worse. There was another war that broke out 60 years later. The Roman Empire, you know, got stronger. And I think the expectation in the Old Testament prophets, and I think what the writer of Revelation is thinking, is that, yeah, the temple is going to be destroyed, but those who destroyed the temple, they were going to be destroyed as well. Just like, you know, the Assyrians were used to destroy the northern kingdom. God would have destroyed the Assyrians too. There would be a payback there. And so things got worse for Jews. You know, Jewish Christian things got worse for Christians. So there wasn't a big change that took place. I think that's why we don't see this idea of everything fulfilled until our time.
Right. Those are some great points, Jeremy. What do you think, SoCal?
Well, I'm glad that Jeremy is very open about his, you know, his, I don't know, maybe the struggles might not be the right one, but your thought process and what you're going through and how you're being open and transparent about this. So it's very healthy, and thank you, brother. And it's encouraging, and I don't take it lightly at all. I take it very seriously, because the truth of the matter is many Christians are going through what you're going through. Okay. And a lot of them are afraid to speak up. Okay. And so hopefully they have you know, if anyone is watching this that is in going through what you're going through, hopefully they'll be edified and be strengthened by what we're talking about today. So what I would like to add that hopefully would be edifying and encouraging is really try to get into let's try to look at what are some examples of some of the differences between some of the earlier epistles and then some of the later epistles. The other thing too, though, is that I might push back on this is some of the dating of some of the epistles. Like, for example, I think Galatians and Hebrews are actually later epistles, and I'll get into that later. But, you know, those are things that at the end of the day, I think that they're going to, make it very clear that there is a difference. But also, if we were to really analyze the internal evidence, we do see that there is one in the same author. Now, let me go back. I wanted to quote this earlier from Forgotten Truths, because Jeremy, you really got to get this book. It's an easy read. It's short and sweet, and I think that you would really benefit from it.
I read one of his books. I read his book on the 70 weeks.
The Coming Prince, which is his most popular book. Yeah, that's his most popular. But this right here is Forgotten Truth. A lot of people have forgotten about it. But, you know, here's what he says in chapter 8, the second coming, when? ? It's just 2 pages, so it'll just take me 2 minutes. It is a fact of great significance that the coming of the Lord is never mentioned in the epistles of the New Testament, save in an incidental manner. Never once as a doctrine that needed to be expounded, but only and always as a truth with which every Christian was supposed to be familiar. This is strikingly exemplified by the passages already cited, and it explains what to some may seem strange, that there is no notice of the coming in Ephesians or Colossians. If these were the latest of the Apostle Paul's epistles, the omission might possibly suggest to some that the hope had been abandoned. But not only does it appear in Philippians, which was also written from his Roman prison, but as we have seen, one of the fullest and clearest references to it is contained in Titus, which was written at a still later date than quote unquote the captivity epistles. The coming is not mentioned in Ephesians. When he mentions the coming, he's speaking of the Parousia in Ephesians and Colossians, but neither is justification by faith. A quote-unquote higher critic might find in this a proof of different authorship, and a lawyer might think that each book of the New Testament ought to begin with recitals and with many a quote-unquote whereas, referring to the contents of earlier writings. But happily, the scriptures are not written in that fashion. I'm almost done. The fact is clear, then, that in apostolic times, the converts were taught to expect the Lord's return. So certain is this indeed that discussion would be useless with any who deny it. But what explanation can be found for the no less salient fact that although we have reached the 20th century of the Christian era, the hope appears to be no near its fulfillment? Rejecting the infidel taunt that the teaching was erroneous and the hope which is inspired a delusion, we are shut up to choose between the following alternatives. Either the promise has been canceled or withdrawn, or else, owing to some cause which came fully into operation after the close of the sacred canon, its fulfillment has been delayed. But all the promises of God are assured in Christ, and there is no variableness with him. The one alternative, therefore, we reject. The other shall be considered in the sequel. So, again, just another reason, a little teaser why this book is highly recommended to read. It's been a huge help, and it's a must read. The other one, and Phelan, you obviously will agree, the Foundation of Dispensational Truth. There's so much in this book that is extremely helpful. There's things that I totally disagree, but here's what I love about someone like Bullinger. When I do disagree with him, I find out so much about what I think the truth is, where it is, and how it can be revealed. And so just take that in mind. So there's a lot of meat. Yes, I think there's some bones that Bullinger teaches, but regardless, I want everyone to understand that I think it's a great read that is struggling or wanting to know more about this thing that we're talking about, trying to understand, as the title says, the challenges of Paul's epistles, because there are challenges. Well, we quote challenges, really not to us who understand it, and I see that with full confidence, but there are people that it's a challenge to. And Jeremy, I think you're open about it. Like, hey, look, there's some things that are straight up challenging for me. I'm going to take the neutral position. Now, one of the things I think that Bullinger really pointed out to me that was very helpful, and I think will help us in the discussion, is the book Revelation. Because I take the stance, and I'm a dispensationalist, by the way, I take the stance that the book of Revelation was written before 70 AD. I think there's plenty of proof for that, and I believe there's definitely textual proof for that. And I'll quote from Bullinger, and he has this to say, which is very how do I say, powerful. He says this on page 126 of his book, The Foundations of Dispensational Truth. He says, to understand the apostles' teaching here, we shall have to compare and contrast what is said on this subject in the Apocalypse, which is the book of Revelation. To connect the two, if will first be necessary to consider the date of the writing of the Apocalypse, and to the date, the evidence is divided between an earlier or a later date. That is to say, whether it was written during that age, that is the age during the apostles, prior to the fall, and therefore before the destruction of Jerusalem, or whether it was written after that great time dividing event, which is AD 70, which Phelan really has stressed that we need to focus on that being a great divider of time. We declare here for the earlier date, which I do too, on the authority of the Syriac version, which was quoted by Melito. Now, here's the wild thing. It is a documented manuscriptural, whatever you want to call it, fact. I just made up a word, that there is an ancient Syriac version. You can even see this in John Gill. He makes a note of this too. He doesn't agree with it, but he's a great scholar, he's a great teacher, and he's willing to be open and let everyone know, like, here's what's on the table. You decide. But there's an ancient Syriac version, which makes it very clear that John wrote during the time of Nero. Let me quote what the Syriac version reads in the heading: the revelation which was made by God to John the Evangelist in the island of Patmos, to which he was banished by Nero the emperor. Now, here's what Bullinger adds, and I'm going somewhere with this. Bullinger says this. Remember, I'm gonna say this again. We declare here for the earlier date on the authority of the Syriac version, which was quoted by Melito as early as AD 70 and is thus older than any other authority and much older than any Greek manuscript extant. And he goes on and gives more evidence. And plus, there's more internal evidence, and there's definitely more external evidence for what I'm saying. And he addresses the whole Irenaeus thing, which is easy to address. But still, here's the thing: what I'm getting at, I believe that Paul had access to the book Revelation. That's what I believe. I believe that much of what Paul was teaching earlier, especially when you look at first 1 and 2 Thessalonians, I see a lot of correlation when what's going on in Revelation, and obviously what was prophesied in the Old Testament. So what we have to realize is that, does Paul have access to the book of Revelation? And if he does, and remember, I'm a dispensationalist, and a dispensationalist, mostly, Bullinger was the only few that I know that would step out and say, no. We can say with certainty that the book of Revelation was in 70 AD. Most dispensationalists today, and I think even Scofield would say, no, it cannot be. It has to be after 70 AD to fit our formula. That's not true at all. I don't believe that. But here's what I'm getting at. Was Paul influenced, or did Paul have access to and was part of the same revelation that John was given? I do believe so. But what we have to also handle is that when we take a look, and I know you don't believe Peter wrote to Peter, but I do think there's a great importance in Peter, because it's in Peter that we get this connection with Paul's writings with what is influencing Peter himself. And Peter makes it very clear. He doesn't say, you guys think, like, he makes it very clear that he thinks Paul's writings are hard understood. He doesn't say, like, if you're not right with God or you're not a real Christian, you can't understand his writings. He puts himself in that bucket too. So if we're to say, okay, is book Revelation pre 70 AD? I do believe it is. Then we have to ask the question: does Paul is there do we see any correlation between the book Revelation and any influence between the two? I do believe we do early on. And my personal opinion is that I think the book Revelation was, very, very much influential on Paul's early epistles. But with all that said, I think that the book Revelation was in Paul's hands. He had access to it. He knew about it, or at least he knew about the revelation through the Holy Ghost, and that it's aligned with it. But then we see a change as it moves on later to his prison epistles. Thoughts, comments, questions?
Yeah, I agree with you about the book of Revelation being pre-AD 70. I probably don't date it as early as you do, but I think that I can't see that it was written in AD 95. To me, that's no way. And again, Irenaeus is one of my favorite commentators. I love Irenaeus, but I do depart from his opinion. And as a matter of fact, there's a book by Robert Young, who translated the literal version of the Bible, and it's a commentary on the New Testament. And in that commentary, he writes that what happened was there was I'll have to find, in fact, I'll look for it when you're speaking, Jeremy, but you had mentioned Tristan a few moments ago. And I think he had a big impact on me on, starting to put things into better perspective, because I've been reading John Humphrey Noyes and I wish I could find his book. He had a doctor where what he did was he came out with some verses, where John, I think in John's epistle, where he says, he who is born again does not commit sin, and he who commits sin is of the devil. And he says what he's talking about is they had the first regeneration, but there's another regeneration that they were waiting for in the first century. Now, he went down the road of perfectionism, and he said, well, we have to, as Christians, we need to work on the second regeneration. And once we have the second regeneration, we won't sin anymore. And so he kind of went off into la la land with that. But I was thinking about it more and more, and I was saying, wait a minute, he's got a point, because they were already regenerated, like you pointed out, Jeremy, seated in heavenly places and all that, but they were still waiting for another, phase 2, if you will, of a change, something that was part of their experiential salvation. And so when Tristan brought out, he started asking questions like, well, what kind of brain chemistry, took place when the resurrection happened? How did they know? Did they participate in it mentally? Was it a light switch that went off in their heads? Was it, an aha moment? Was it a warm, fuzzy feeling? And I started thinking of it. And that's when I said, we need to, this whole thing with physical, spiritual, was the resurrection physical? Is it spiritual? All that stuff, that doesn't, to me, that's okay. Those are important issues from a theological standpoint, but they're not the issues. I don't think they're as important as, say, focusing on, well, how would it manifest itself when it was fulfilled? So we could talk about whether it was fulfilled, but supposing everything in Scripture is fulfilled, we still have to address, how they knew it was, if they were supposed to know, or if they weren't supposed to know. Would it enter their their cognitive sphere? Would it enter? Were there any noetic effects that this would have on them? Were there? I'm not talking about bodies coming out of the graves. I'm talking about, it could have been a spiritual resurrection for all we know, but was it something that would be experienced? And I think that the cumulative evidence is that, yes, they were waiting for a further manifestation of whatever salvation they already had. And so same thing pretty much that Christians have been doing for the last 2,000 years. We're waiting for, we know that nobody says this is as good as it's going to get. Okay, so when you die, you're going to go to heaven, or you're going to go to Hades and you're going to wait for the resurrection. There's all different views, but I don't know any Christian that says this is like as good. What we have now is as good as it's ever going to get. So we're all, to that extent, we're all futurists. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, you're 100% right. To that extent, we are all futurists, because we're all hoping for something better than what's going on right now. I think everybody, no matter what, what view you have. I like what SoCal was saying about Revelation. I think that Revelation is a big part of this, of figuring this stuff out. I think Paul, so. I don't know if I've never heard of this. Let me know if you've heard of this hermeneutic. I've never heard anyone say it, but and preterist, one of the things that's stressed, and it's important, and one of the things that kind of makes you see the Bible differently, and it's a good thing. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but the idea of audience relevance. I think Dave, you said about the sits and leaving, right? What did it mean to them, right? That's very important part of understanding these things. But when we look at these scriptures and we say, well, what would it have meant to the original audience? Well, we don't know. The common people of those days didn't read or write for the most part. There was very low literacy level. So we don't even know what the original audience would have thought. But we have the author writing. So I've been thinking a lot about what it meant to the author, what the author was trying to convey. What about author's relevance? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if there's a word for it, but I think about authors. I think where this comes in is, you really, if you think you know the scriptures pretty well, read them again, right? We have to read them over and over again. And the more you read them, and I'm not saying I've reached that point. I'm just saying, for me, it was very eye-opening for me just to read in 1 week or 2 weeks, or whatever it was, to in-depthly read all of Paul's letters and take notes the whole time. After doing YouTube for 5 years, and being in church, and being raised in a Christian home, going to vacation Bible school and memorizing these scriptures, I feel like when I read them all just recently, I feel like I read them for the first time again, because there's so much there. And so you kind of get in Paul's head when you really read him and study him in depth. And I think that what Paul was expecting, because Paul never met he never met Jesus, the earthly Jesus. He never met him, right? He met the heavenly Jerusalem, the heavenly Jesus. He had a revelation of the risen Jesus. So in all his letters, he's not talking about the birth. He's not talking about genealogy. He's not talking about even the empty tomb. He was died, and he buried and ascended into heaven. So I think what Paul's thinking is about a heavenly transformation. And I think that's what's consistent in Jewish thought of heaven coming to earth. And I think that the liturgy of the church, of the historic church, I go to a Lutheran church, but we still follow a liturgy. And I was reading in our liturgy last week. I saved the bulletin. I don't have it down here. I should have it, but it talked about after the Eucharist about, bringing heaven to earth through this process. So I think that's what early Christians were doing in the liturgy. They were, again, but that wasn't the ultimate, right? That was in the interim, what we call this interim period of worship and prayer and bringing heaven to earth. So I think that Paul's idea is bringing heaven to earth, and I think it would go along with Revelation. I think that Paul would agree. I think where you have good evidence, Dave, Paul knowing Revelation is Revelation 21. I think heaven, the holy city coming down in Revelation 21 in a new heaven and new earth. I think that is Paul's idea of resurrection. I think that's what he's seeing, the heavenly kingdom come to earth, because he's saying we will be changed. And I struggle with this. What is the change? Is it a spiritual change? Well, the spiritual change was already there, right? So is it a second dose of the spiritual change? What is that change? I think Paul was thinking big. And remember, Paul is a Pharisee. He's a Jew. Every single prophecy of the resurrection in the Old Testament has to have the regathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. So if your resurrection paradigm doesn't have the regathering of the 12 tribes of Israel, you don't really have something that's going to work. And in those three passages, look them up, right? Isaiah 26, okay, Daniel 12:2, everyone knows, and Ezekiel 37. Remember, Daniel is writing at the same condition that Ezekiel's writing and Daniel's writing it in the exile. Daniel's seeing past the exile. He's saying, okay, the 70 years is up. Now what? 70 years is up. Now what? We were promised a new covenant and the regathering. So it's all. So Daniel's prayer in Daniel 9 is for the whole house of Israel. Even though they've been scattered 200 years before, his prayer was for the whole house of Israel. When Ezekiel saw the valley of dry bones, he said the whole house of Israel is in the valley of dry bones, himself included. He's alive, but covenantally, they're in exile. They're out of the land. They're out of God's covenant. And so in Isaiah 26 talks about the dead bodies rising up out of the earth, but that's tied to the 12 tribes too, because if you read in 27, it ends with your brothers who were lost in the land of Assyria will be gathered together again, and talks about the trumpet. Paul talks about the trumpet. The trumpet's all over the place. So and look, I differ because I don't believe in a physical body resurrection. I don't believe in that. I think that you can make a strong case for that not being what Paul was thinking. But there is this idea that's missing, is this regathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, how do we? That would be the thing that's missing and most difficult. And Dave, when we were doing our temple debate, and you talked about you mentioned that, and at the beginning of the debate, you said, "Hey, we're not going to talk about. We're just going to focus on this one subject. But if these other topics come in, let it be." And I started going, and you said, you believe that happened, right? And I just said yes, but I couldn't tell you how it happened. I mean, is there anyone out there can really prove how it happened? It seems like it was a scattering, a further scattering than a regathering. And I know people would say, I understand. I know covenant body. I know all the views. I know the individual body view. I know that there's a theory to make that work. But these are some of the things why I think that we should be just more careful with, just planting our flag on something, which is I'm being very careful now. So even though I'm seeing all these things, I'm saying all these things, I don't have a system to unite all this thing together that says this is my view, which is why I'm being neutral on it. I'm just taking it for what it is. I think there's other possibilities. You had Aaron on about the sign of Jonah, right? And I disagree with him on a lot of things, right? But he's, I think God can do what he wants to do, right? God can do whatever he wants. If he wants to delay it, he can delay it. I think maybe it's something. Almost every time somebody had an expectation that they knew was going to happen, you could even go back to the garden. it seems like Adam was given a pardon. He was given there was a sacrifice there. So I that's the thing. The neutrality I'm saying is just I don't know. I see all these things, and it's helpful to talk through them. And I think it also, being neutral on this as best as I can be, also opens the door to have these conversations where I don't have to prove my view. I don't have to try to debunk the other, and maybe it'll lead us closer to figuring out. I'm not saying I'm giving up on figuring this stuff out. This is why I'm still here. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Maybe someday, right? I'll plant my flag on something, but it's gonna be a long time.
Jeremy? What's preventing you from planting your flag?
I can't make it all work. Like the whole thing about a delay. Like I see the same things you're seeing. We're agreeing on what we see. I'm just not seeing a smoking gun or a strong evidence that was the case. And for me, it's hard to believe that all this stuff is going to happen all over again. A temple is going to be rebuilt and all that. That's really that's what's hard for me.
Mm-hmm. Why is that hard?
Because I don't see enough evidence in the scripture that would tell me that was what the plan was.
Okay. Now, one thing we discussed last time we all met, at least you and I feeling, was precedence. And we do see precedence with this happening in the Old Testament. Did you notice that, Jeremy? When we discussed that, did you catch that?
Precedence of it happening in the Old Testament?
Yeah. So, for example, there's a prophecy in the Old Testament, and it's directed to and it's clearly evident that it's directed towards the people during that time, and it didn't happen. Okay, and then it happened later on, not when it was supposed to. I guess what I'm getting at is understanding that there's precedence for what we're talking about today in the Old Testament. Don't you think that would potentially provide the evidence that you need to, I guess you could say, plant your flag?
I don't think so.
Okay. Now, just so I want to make sure do you know what I'm talking about?
Are you trying to convert me to dispensationalism tonight?
No. I think because I want to have a good conversation, because I think it's a good. Because here's the thing, is feeling, and if you can, please, if you could add to this, the idea of precedence, okay? Because this like everything we're talking about when it comes to whatever, a fancy way of just saying, how to interpret something, hermeneutic, okay? It's just a fancy way. Biblical hermeneutics is no different than the way a Supreme Court justice interprets the U.S. Constitution. They're literally everything is the exact same, okay? As far as going back and studying how culturally that phrase was used, the words, the people, the culture, everything, the context of everything. It's the same principle. It's not like all of a sudden you get in the Bible, it's like some magical different little process. Now, how do we figure out whether or not this verse is saying what it's saying? No, it's the same. It's the same process when you look at the U.S. Constitution. I always use that as an analogy. Now, one of the things in the Supreme Court, they always go back to precedence, and that's what I'm getting at. And so, in the Old Testament, we do see a precedent of what we're discussing today. That's what I'm stressing.
Okay. Would you saying that what precedent would you say? Like you're going to Jonah, or?
Well, you could go to the regathering of the 10 tribes of Israel. You can go into Amos, and I brought this up in my debate with Steve Gregg, and I'm like, when did this happen? When did the northern tribes come back and rebuild? They never did. There's numerous. I would say more fingers that I'm holding up. That there are times where the prophecies are directed towards that people at that time when that prophet is living, and they do not happen when that prophet is living. In fact, when you go to like Joel, for example, the day of the Lord is at hand. So what I'm getting at is the same language that we're discussing that I was quoting from Book of Revelation and what was mentioned by Forgotten Truth. I think it's important to see, like, hey, can we go back to the Old Testament and see the same type of pattern we're talking about right now? That's really what I'm just stressing.
Well, you got some points there, and this is a quote that this sticks with me. I'll read it real quick, but this is from Eli Lazorkin, Eisenberg, and Pinchas Shear. They were the book is called Hebrew Insights from Revelation. It's Jewish Studies for Christian, Book 1. And he says, for contemporary readers, it is exceedingly common to think of prophecy as predictive. However, to an Israelite mind, prophecy was primarily a proclamation of previously known truth, a call to return to something forgotten, and a warning not to forget the important matters. So I can see maybe what you're saying there, because we think of, I don't think that there's double fulfillment and things like that. I just think that it's clear that they could use a prophecy and use that prophecy and apply it to something current in their day. The Dead Sea Scrolls show this. They have these, what they call peshers, the Habakkuk pesher. They could take something that was fulfilled in the past and apply it to their present time. So one of the examples would be, Jesus saying that was just spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Well, Daniel, right? There are many candidates for who fulfilled that prophecy, right? Antiochus the Fourth, all those things that Daniel's timeline, the 70 weeks, you can, and some people do. And Sam Frost wrote a very good book about it, even though I disagree with it. He wrote the Antiochus Epiphanes, and that time of the Maccabees was all that Daniel was talking about. And guess what? It lines up. The 1290, you can make it. The seventh the little horn. You could also make that Pompey. Pompey went in, to the holy place. He went in there. He was a pagan that went into the temple, and that could be a considered abomination of desolation. Caligula, he died before he could make it happen, but he had planned on making a statue, and in fact did make the statue of himself. It just never got in place. That could have been, even Herod paganizing the temple could have been an abomination of desolation. And then what happened in 70 AD when the Romans came in and were sacrificing in the temple? So there's so many times when you could. So is Jesus saying that this was a future prophecy, or is it going to be like this that happened back then? I don't want to confuse everybody, but all I'm saying is that quote right there shows that that's why this is difficult. And sometimes a prophecy, even if it's written after we say it was written after 70, how could it be relevant? Well, because maybe there's just something more to what they were thinking when they were applying these prophecies to their current day.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I could push back on those gentlemen that were giving that commentary on Book of Revelation, and what sources are they citing? Because here's the thing: we have the source. Like they make it sound as if like there's these people that we don't understand. It's like, well, we have their writings right here. Right. So I think, are they higher critics? Are they not? Are they like conservative? Are they traditional? Because that actually changes a lot. Sorry, I'm making an adjustment here, but still though, it still doesn't. We still gotta address. Like we could go back and we could put on our same type of conversation we're having here and go back and start talking about Old Testament. Same thing. The same things were happening. I know that one clear one was when I in 2 Ezra chapter 2, 2 Ezra chapter 2, when it talks about I would gather you as a hen gathers her chickens. That when that is said, that's actually speaking during that time to those actual people during that time when Ezra prophesied that. And anyone who thinks that 2 Ezra is post 180, I'll give you $2 billion if you can prove that, and you won't win, by the way. But still, here's the deal: is that when 2 Ezra is when it's said in 2 Ezra, it's said at that time. But then Jesus quotes it later, but he's using it for the second temple. So I think we got to really hone down on, first, do we have precedence for what we're talking about? We do. And so because we have precedence for having this type of discussion and for building this, and feeling does, then I think we say now we have more credibility to move forward with saying, look, it makes sense then for Paul's message to change, and then for it to, as I like the word I like to use, abeyance, for the judgment to go in abeyance, for what was supposed to happen to stop and go on pause, but not end, and that it will be restarted. And that's where we get into dispensationalism. But even without getting dispensationalism, I think you have to recognize that most definitely Paul changes his tune from, hey, well, let me take a step back. Paul, I think, goes all the way from making it very clear that Christ, he can still come back during my time. He can still come back during my time. So, okay, wait, we need to start getting bishops. We need to start getting elders. Okay, guys, I'm about to depart. Just keep the faith. Okay. So there is a change. Peter, I think, is the most clear, the one that's the clearest one of where we see a change. I'm going to stop. I'm going to look for that verse, feeling. When I get a chance, I do want to show a difference between 1 Peter and 2 Peter, but I'll stop, feeling.
Okay. And we will have a question from Tristan. Tristan's going to weigh in with a question, but first and you guys can answer. I'm not going to answer. It'll take too long, but I did find this book here. This is Young's Concise Critical Commentary on the New Testament. It was actually published by Gary DeMar with a forward by Gary DeMar. Anyways, it says under the book of Revelation in the introduction, it says it was written in Patmos about AD 68, whither John had been banished by Domitius Nero, as stated in the title of the Syriac version of the book. And with this concurs the express statement of Irenaeus, who says it happened in the reign of Domitianu, that is Domitius Nero. Sulpicius Severus, Orosius, etc., stupidly mistaking Domitianu for Domitianicos, supposed Irenaeus to refer to Domitian AD 95, and most succeeding writers have fallen into the same blunder. The internal testimony is wholly in favor of the earlier date. The temple at Jerusalem was still standing. The exact duration of the siege is foretold, 42 months. The two witnesses. So he was taking a preteristic view of the book, which I don't take. I think, to be honest, and people get angry when I say this, but I think that Nero had just died, and there was a rumor in the Roman Empire that he was going to come back and that he was going to raise hell again.
Nero Rendivius.
Yeah.
It's in the Sibylline Oracles.
Yep.
Yeah.
And he was expecting Nero to rise from the dead and become the eighth of the seven. And what happened was, of course, that would have happened had they gotten that 144,000 number filled up. But they were working on it during the first century, and the apostasy just totally canceled that. But Paul had already revealed in advance that there would be an intercalary or intermediate age between Israel's exile and Israel's regathering. And so I do kind of take a dispensational position, except I think the parenthesis is like from AD 70 to, Daniel's 70th week. But again, I'm close to the dispensational position, but I don't follow full body dispensationalism, because I don't think there's two people of God in the Bible. I think there's only one people of God. But again, these are things that we can, debate about, discuss, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of different views, but let me go ahead and post Tristan's question. So Tristan, 21st century mind, he's asking, was the regathering of the 12 tribes was fulfilled in 70 AD or after 70 AD? Should Christians today focus on regathering the lost sheep of Israel within Christian evangelism? So let's answer this. So go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was going to say this is a big problem for me, because I know it's there. When I say it depends, all of these consummation resurrection texts depend on the regathering of the 12 tribes. I don't know how that could have been done in the past. I don't know how it could be done now. I just know that that's what Daniel was looking for. That's what Ezekiel was looking for. That's what Jeremiah was looking for. That's what all the prophets were looking for, that regathering. And so we have to have that as our foundation. I think anyone would agree with that. I mean, the idea of resurrection didn't just, pop up in the first century. Its foundation is in the prophets. So when you have them scattered, now maybe there's something to the fullness of the Gentiles in Romans 11, because in Genesis maybe 48, Ephraim was to be, in some translations, it's multitude of nations, but if you look in Young's literal translation, it's fullness. So could the 12 tribes simply, and could it be because is that God's way of just scattering throughout the world and bringing people in? Are are Gentiles now? Are we the lost tribes? Are those who come who believe? Are we part? This is something. This is one another big part of my neutrality, because I can't answer this. But I would want to share something, and I didn't want to say this, but because it might pump up the Israel only people. I don't want to do that. I don't agree with Israel only, but the Bible is very Israel centric. And someone asked Tovia Singer. I was watching an interview with him and an atheist, and it was great. It was great. Atheist was like throwing all kinds of hard questions at him. He's just like cool, calm, and collected, answering everyone, giving good answers. And he said, well, he kind of asked the same question. Well, what about, who are the lost tribes, or how does a Gentile convert to Judaism? And he said, we feel that, if someone converts to Judaism, they always had a Jewish soul, right? They were, maybe at some point in their genealogy, they were forced to convert, or they escaped, persecution, but they came back because God kind of they had a Jewish soul. I thought that's just pretty interesting. I think that's a neat thought. It's just interesting to hear the way someone like him would think of these things. Now, I'm not saying that's what I agree with. I don't have a solution, so I don't have an answer. David, what do you say?
What do I say? Give me a second. I'm gonna make sure I say this in the best way possible. Give me a second. All right. So first things first, I have openly taught that the Bible is all about the origin and destiny of the nation of Israel, and that those who are non-Israelites are simply, I don't want to say a footnote, but they are definitely not spoken of much, unless it has to do with the nation of Israel. Okay. And I understand, like, the first 10 or so chapters of Genesis, talks about those who are non-Israelites, basically because there was no Israel there. But again, I still think the reason that's those chapters are there because they're the foundations of the origin and destiny of Israel. So I don't think that's a novel thought. Also, while I do think British Israelism is very interesting, and I think there's a lot of valid lessons within classical British Israelism, the type that was in existence during the Victorian era, not the type that was co-opted by the Worldwide Church of God, which polluted it and eventually twisted it, and then morphed into other things. But ultimately, I would say that as far as the regathering of the 12 tribes, it definitely was not fulfilled in AD 70, and it definitely has not been fulfilled yet. And one of the things that's interesting is I got a good book, and I highly recommend it, Tristan. And Tristan, I hope you're doing well, brother. I hope all is well. I hope you're having some good roles. But check out this book, The Post-Captivity Names of Israel. It's very fascinating, very, very informative, and I would say very scholarly. And what it focuses on is this idea of really trying to understand the difference between the southern and the northern tribes, and showing its relationship with this term that we usually think of as just non-Jews, Gentiles, which the word Gentiles does not mean non-Jews. People need to understand that not all Israelites are Jews, but all Jews are Israelites. And if you get that statement, you'll get what I'm about to tell you in just a second. But when you take a look at the Jewish prayer book, okay, you can actually take a look at the Jewish prayer book. But still in the Jewish prayer book, they pray for the regathering of the northern tribes. Okay, so when you go and you take a look at the Jewish prayer book, the official classical traditional one, it has a very insightful stuff to say about the regathering. So even within I would say traditional conservative Judaism, there's still this idea that the 10 tribes have not have regathered, and it's still something to be happening in the future. Can you go real quick back to the question, the second half? I want to make sure I answer the second half for Tristan, if you can.
Yeah,
what is,
I've got. Go ahead and post it. And then we got a question from Ben. Let me go ahead and.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
And then, should Christians today focus on regathering lost sheep? No, I think what Christians should be doing, because in this dispensation, as a dispensationalist, I believe at this point, God is not judging the nation of Israel. God, we are at this point is, for example, if I meet someone who is a descendant of the tribe of Judah, that's nothing miraculous is going to happen. it's like they're just like everybody else. They don't have a different standing as they did, or they're going to be treated differently as they were prior to 80-70. Okay, that to me, I think, is a consistent dispensational thought. So no, everyone today needs to be evangelized the same way. And now, lastly, I'll end it with this. Again, I'm quoting from Forgotten Truth. This is chapter 6. This is page 40, and he says this, and this relates to your question, Tristan. The Lord Jesus' return. A fruitful cause both of skepticism and of error is ignorance of what many be described as the ground plan and main purpose of the Old Testament scriptures. Quote, and by the way, he's quoting Dean Alford. He's quoting Dean Alford, by the way, his commentary here on Luke chapter 24, verse 27. But quoting Dean Alford, he says this, quote, the whole scriptures are a testimony to Christ. The whole history of the chosen people, with its types and its laws and its prophecies, is a shewing forth of him, unquote. Now, Sir Anderson is quoting what Dean Alford just said. Now, here's what Sir Anderson has to say about what Dean just said, or Mr. Alford just said. This, however, is the spiritual teaching of the Bible, which, of course, unspiritual men ignore. And I'm here referring to what any intelligent reader ought to recognize. The book relates, that's the Bible, the book relates to, in the main, to the Hebrew race. A brief preface of 11 chapters tells us all that we are concerned to know what, quote unquote, the earth and man prior to the call of Abraham. We are there told of the creation and fall of Adam, that the human family sprang from a first man, but not as he came from the hand of God. For our first progenitor was a sinner and an outcast. And real quick, in that same preface, are we briefly recorded certain great crises in human history, the most notable being the judgment of the flood. And then he goes on, he says, ultimately what he's stressing is, going back to what he says, the book relates in the main to the Hebrew race. So we cannot forget that the Bible is about the origin and destiny of the nation of Israel. And sadly, today, many have failed to recognize that.
Yeah, I agree. It's pretty much, it's an Israel-centered book. And a lot of what Christianity has done is they've taken Jewish promises that relate specifically to the Jewish, I hate to say it, Davidic kingdom, because now I sound like a dispensationalist, but it's okay because I think this is something that we learned, after hundreds of years of being in the Dark Ages. Then we had sola scriptura, and people started to study the Bible. And then finally the light went off and people started saying, wait a minute, why are we saying that, whenever we see Israel or Jacob or, we're importing the church into that. So I think it's good to take the scriptures in their grammatical, historical, contextual interpretation. I think that's good. Whether we could systematize that or how far we should systematize that, that's another story. Ben's got a question.
Ben.
Yeah, so he's asking pretty much, okay, so this is kind of like a two-pronged question. He said, I suppose my first question is, what is SoCal's proof for this thought process that Paul's making positional changes for later in his life? Saying the word sitzim lieben isn't evidence. And then he said, let me go ahead and, he says, why can't these other pastoral epistles be from the school of Paul's thought process, but after Paul? That too would be sitzim lieben. So he's saying, well, I guess he's saying maybe the pastoral epistles could be written after Paul. I don't know. But he says those left after Paul's death would have to deal with the reality. So, I think he's got a good point. But the thing is there a difference between Paul's earlier message and his later message? Did he develop? Was his doctrine in development during this time? And do we see something afterwards, say after Acts 28 or wherever you want to put the dividing line, where we can look back and say, well, look, now he's looking forward, to something beyond his lifetime. Whereas before he was saying, we're going to get caught up in the clouds, we who remain, some stay, he's making it, he's making the terminus point contemporary with himself. Whereas in his later epistles, he seems to be projecting, a lot farther down the road. To me, I think that's pretty clear. But what do you think? We'll let you go first, Jeremy.
Well, yeah, I think what Ben is expressing here is what I was really trying to express with 2 Peter, that what these later epistles show is that was the sitzim lieben of their time. This is what early Christians, I believe this is what early Christians were thinking. I can't prove it, but I think this is what early Christians were thinking after the fall of Jerusalem. And I think a lot of the New Testament is written in the aftermath of this, and that's and this is really, the idea of setting up the church, and having deacons, and having this period where things are not imminent anymore. And look, imminency did continue in Christian history, and it does to our day. I mean, people are still, we have 100% failed, apocalyptic prediction record in Christian history. But I think, just to answer it directly, for me, that's really what I was saying when I was talking about 2 Peter 3. I did a whole video on it. And I think another thing that we overlook, we've been talking a lot about Paul tonight. We're talking a lot about Paul. And I just found a channel that had Don Preston on, and he just had a video, and this guy's kind of, it's called Shade Stone. I just found it. I was watching him, was kind of communicating with him, and he just did a whole video on his idea of universalism, and the whole thing was Paul. And look, without Paul, we wouldn't have Christianity. But why is that? Well, because Paul was, if you read Paul closely, it doesn't appear that Paul was the most popular guy during his time. And even S.G.F. Brandon, in his book, it deals with the fall of the after effects of the fall of Jerusalem, talks about how Paul people started gaining popularity after the fall of Jerusalem. And so I think when we see texts that are heavily Pauline, like 2 Peter 3, even 1 Peter, that's kind of an indicator, like, this is written at a time where Paul's popularity had been, or Paul's credibility had been higher. Just go to a church service and see how many things are Pauline in the liturgy. Even communion, the idea of communion. There's so many things, and I think that's some evidence that these things are written later.
SoCal, what do you think? Well, this was actually originally posed to you, so go ahead.
How dare you, Jeremy? No, just kidding. No, that's all good. No, it's good. No, because I'm glad, because there's things that you mentioned that I'm like, yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because
I'll go on a wormhole.
I get to quote the book again, Forgotten Truths. So this is and it's related to what you just said, and I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna tie it all in with what Ben's asking. But in chapter 1, he begins this: questions raised. The lapse of time has not effaced from my memory the details of a conversation of many years ago with a liberal-minded and cultured Jewish rabbi. He introduced himself by telling me that he was a student of the New Testament, and that my friend, the then chief rabbi, had recommended one of my expository books to his attention. And he said this: "We regard Jesus as one of the greatest of our rabbis," was his opening remarks. And he added, "It was not he that founded Christianity, but your Paul." I astonished him by replying that beneath his assertion there lay as truth which the theology of Christendom had let slip. For the words of the Lord Jesus were explicit: "I am not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Salvation is of the Jews." And I'll stop right there. Another reason why you all need to get this book. Very relevant, especially to the conversation, obviously, we've been having tonight. But here's the deal. Yes, you take Paul, and you take Paul out, and let me take a step back. Let's say you took out the book of Acts, okay? And nobody ever had the book of Acts. And you went from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then you went smack right into Romans, okay? Traditionally, the way we have it. Even though I would like to point out, though, and I have nothing wrong with the order of books in my Bible. I have nothing wrong with that. But it also must be pointed out that, and this relates to the book Revelation and Paul, but there is early evidence, very early evidence, that the book Revelation was written before Paul's epistles, based upon some of the listings of some of the Bibles. And I was trying to find that. I'll try to get it. If I don't get it, I'll leave it in the comments. But it's extremely important to
I know which one it is. It's the Moratorian Canon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So anyways, so that right there. But my point is saying that is that, and it goes to your question, Ben. It's all gonna lead to what you're asking. But what I'm ultimately trying to point out is that if we take out the book of Acts and you go from John to Romans, it's gonna look like what's going on, like what just happened. Okay, thankfully the book of Acts goes in there and is a bridge to what's happening. now this is me, and I know this isn't Phelan, I know this isn't you, Jeremy, but I've been, this is what I've been debating for, a couple years openly on Standing for Truth, and maybe other channel here or there. But is that, just on your channel too, I did debate this with Tristan. But the difference between James and Paul, okay? And I think that's important to understand because that is relevant to the conversation. And Jeremy, you and I both know that. So that's an whole other conversation. But here's the deal. If we get to trying to understand what I mean by the sitz Leben, obviously I could say sitz Leben. What I'm trying to express to everybody is just, look, y'all, just put yourself in their shoes. That's David's way of saying it. Put yourself in their shoes. When you're reading, like, for example, when you're reading 1 Thessalonians, sit back, put yourself there at that time. And if you were at during that time, how would you read that letter? Well, the way I would read it is like, well, Paul's telling me, he's freaking me out, man. Like, this sounds like we're all going to die. Like, there's some letters or some verses I read that it sounds like we're going to die. Like, expect to die and take it in a glorious way. Take it like a champ. And so what we see, and I said this in the beginning in my quote unquote opening, is that Paul never stops. And this is my personal opinion. What happens is with Paul, he keeps teaching the parousia. He keeps teaching the coming. Now, Bullinger disagrees with me on that. Okay, Bullinger thinks that what's happened is, and he has somewhat of an argument that even like he uses the word parousia, and that how it's not used after so many. It's not used later on in some of his latest epistles, I believe. And I could be wrong, but I think that's one of his main arguments. And correct if I'm wrong about that. But here's the deal: is that I think what's happening is that Paul is simply he is still believing in that Christ can come any moment. He can come any moment, but what is happening, though, is at the end of his ministry, he is setting up the continuation of the church. So he has a contingency plan. Now, 1 and 2 Peter, I believe, are add more credence to what I'm saying. I do believe when you read the message of Peter, 1 Peter, it's different than 2 Peter in its tone, and this is why it's important when you even get to 1 Peter and you look at 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 13. It says, "Yea, I think it meet, as long as I am in this tabernacle, to stir you up in putting in you in remembrance, knowing that surely I must put off this my tabernacle, even as I, Lord Jesus Christ, has showed me." But if you go to 1 Peter, you get the sense of like, hey guys, he could come during my time. Like, his expectation is like, I'm going to live to see it. Now, when you travel through the rest of 2 Peter, what do we learn about this idea of scoffers saying, where's the promise of his coming? Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were. So, and he makes it very clear. He's like, hey, look, 1,000 years to God is just one day. So I see that there's clearly like what Peter's doing is he's hearkening back to part of his tone and his message in 1 Peter and clearly humbling himself and say, look, well, he's not wrong. He's just saying, look, it's just, hey, God in his long surfing is not coming. Again, I have precedence for what I'm saying. I have precedence within the Old Testament for that that type of teaching and logical thinking.
Well, maybe that could be another video of the precedence in the Old Testament, because I'm not quite there yet with that. I'm not quite seeing it. Maybe you guys could educate me on that.
Just one little quick thing. I know we're starting to get it past the 90-minute mark, but first thing I wanted to do is I just wanted to plug Donnie's book, because we were talking about Daniel's 70th week. We were talking about Daniel's prophecies just a few minutes ago. This is really one of the best books. It's called End Times Revealed, Dawn of the Antichrist by Donnie Bedinsky. This is really, really one of the best modern books out there. It goes through all of Daniel's prophecies. And what he pointed out to me was something that I hadn't seen before. He said the Jewish war actually was from 66 to 73 AD, and the destruction of Jerusalem happened right in the middle. That's when Titus literally stopped the daily sacrifices. I thought of that. I was like, this is brilliant, because that's actually how it happened. Titus stopped the daily sacrifices, but my position is the abomination of desolation wasn't placed at that time. And so all that that last half of the week is still future. Now, I think the full 70th week is future. But what I'm saying is they had a shadow week from 66 to 73. Anyways, as far as precedence goes, I just wanted to say, and I think I said this before in a previous podcast, that the way I look at it is they had some of the prophets were definitely placing messianic prophecies in the lifetime of their immediate audience, like Ezekiel. He had said, he made a big deal about, no prophecies will be delayed anymore. I think it's in Ezekiel chapter 12. And then, later down in several chapters later, he issues all these messianic prophecies. Well, when you get to the first century, you find that there was still a messianic expectation among among Jews. So they knew that these prophecies had been issued within certain time frames, and that they had been, that the original audience was expecting them to happen. But nobody was arguing, saying, well, Ezekiel said everything was going to happen in their day, so therefore we have to look for a Messiah that's already come. Nobody was making those arguments. They were still waiting for the prophecies to be fulfilled. So the way I'm looking at it is, when the prophecy gets put on the conveyor belt, we think it's going to just keep going down the line until it reaches us, and it's not going to stop moving. It's going to keep on rolling, etc. And a lot of that has to do with determinism. It's more of a philosophical debate, I think, than it is a theological one, because, and I don't have time to quote, because I've got William James's book, The Philosophy of William James, up there, and he has an excellent article on determinism versus indeterminism. But that's really, I think it's a philosophical question, because we like to, like I said, we like to deal with data in batches. And so we assume that because prophecies are packaged together, that they all have to take place at the same time. Whereas in reality, Luke 4 blows that sky high when Jesus goes into the synagogue and he reads the prophecy of Isaiah, and he says, the year of favor, and then he stops, he closes the book and hands it back to the minister. Well, that's now, whether you can turn that into an interpretive principle or not is another story. I mean, it may not be an interpretive principle the way that some futurists have made it out to be, but I believe there's something to that. And so prophecies that don't get take place within the lifetime of their original audience, I think they can still be potentially on the conveyor belt until they get fulfilled. And that goes back again to epistemology. How do we know when a prophecy has been fulfilled? Can we just open the book and say, oh, well, it says it was going to get fulfilled soon, therefore it's been fulfilled? Or does there have to be some kind of breakthrough in the realm of experience? Does there have to be something that has to happen, even something falling down, a building falling over? I mean, is there something that has to happen? Now, a building did fall down. Actually, it was destroyed in AD 70, but does that meet all the specifications for the second coming? Again, that's a whole different discussion. That's something we could go back into if you want another time, but I guess I'll let you guys have the last word on this, because I know I'm just rattling off, but
no, it's good.
No, you're good.
What do you think? What do you think, guys?
You brought up a lot of good points there. And so I want to answer your question about what do we need to know that a prophecy was fulfilled? Well, if we want to be consistent, and we want to be, base our interpretation on the scripture as the authority, what we don't have in the New Testament, we do have in the Old Testament as far as prophecy fulfilled, because we can see that the prophets came not to predict something. The prophets didn't come on the scene just to make predictions. They came because it was a call to repentance. It was a call to repentance. It's because something had gone wrong with the nation. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Isaiah. I mean, try to find a prophet that isn't talking about the time period either of the Syrian exile, the Babylonian exile, or beyond that. Because so what we have in the Old Testament is we can read the book of Lamentations and we can see the aftermath. We can read those books and understand how they were fulfilled. And that's what we don't have. And that's what's yet another reason why I say I can't plant my flag, because we can't read a New Testament writer that specifically tells us what was fulfilled after 70 AD, because even though I believe books were written after 70 AD in the Bible, Acts is our one historical book. That's we have Kings as a historical book. We have Acts in the New Testament. The timeline in Acts ends in 62. The year that James the Just was killed, who was the leader, who had been the leader of the movement for 30 years. And we don't even get to learn much about that either, because we only have James appear in Acts, really in Acts 15, where we see his authority. So that's another one of these things where it's just, there's a lot of unanswered questions. Now, I'm not saying that should deter us from trying to understand these things, but maybe it's because when it's fulfilled, we won't have any questions about it. Like, maybe, I don't know. There's got to be a reason why there's nothing that if there was fulfillment in the gospel, it says, well, this happened because it was to fill the words of Isaiah, right? And in one text, it says, we go up to the Jerusalem to fulfill all the things that were written about the Son of Man. And that's talking about the cross. And then you have the Roman armies are surrounded, and that also fulfills all that was written. So this whole idea of when it says fulfills all that was written appears in two contexts. So I don't know, Dave, help me out here.
Well, let me see here. There was something that you said that I wanted to piggyback on. It'll come back to me, I think, Jeremy. But the thing is, the conversation that we're focused on is the challenges of Paul's epistles. And I want to quote from one of his friends, Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 3, which I think is one of the most important chapters in this discussion. That would, I think, really bring things full circle. But I'll just quote maybe 2 verses. And according that the long suffering of our Lord of our Lord is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul also according to the wisdom given unto him hath written unto you, also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which that they that are unlearned and unstable rest, as they do also the other scriptures unto their own destruction. Now, in the beginning of chapter 3, he says this, verse 1, this second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you. And the first epistle he wrote to the scattered, to the dispersion, to what I believe was the northern tribes. So with all that said, I think when you take this, what we talked about earlier, Jeremy, like you made a point in one of our previous discussions, and I love it. It's basically the resurrection and the resurrection and the regathering of the nation of Israel are hand in hand. They are inseparable when you look at it scripturally and biblically. And when we look at who Peter is talking to, trying to, again, who is he talking to? Who's the audience? What's the room temp? And we clearly see that in chapter 3, there's this people scoffing. There's people who have questioned the promises of God. And so we begin to see that also Peter in this last letter makes it clear, like, hey, I'm on my way out, just as Jesus predicted. So farewell. The other thing too, and going back to what you said, Jeremy, is this idea of fulfill, prophecies being fulfilled. How do we know if prophecies have been fulfilled? I've stressed this multiple times that fulfill doesn't mean one and done. It does not mean that at all. I've constantly over the past few months been pushing people to realize that John the Baptist and Elijah, while they were similar and in many ways, John the Baptist fulfilled some of the roles that Elijah would have fulfilled that was prophesied in the Old Testament. John the Baptist did not regather the tribes, and that is the number one role of Elijah when he returns, to regather the northern and the southern tribes, and that has not happened. That hasn't happened. Now, one, you can either say, well, it just failed. You could say it happened spiritually, which no one, but no one. Very few people are going to believe that. The reality is, sorry, full preterists or partial preterists or whoever wants to believe that. But most of us, I think, we're going to try to figure out, like, okay, if the regathering didn't happen, and that was, Tristan, great question, and see that question it must be asked, and every Christian should be asking that question and coming up trying to figure out the answer to it. But see, here's the thing: the 12 tribes have not been regathered, and to try to go back and try to say that, well, the northern tribes are the body of Christ, like, or something, you know. It's like, no, or now we're all northern and southern, we're all mumble jumble, and we're just this mixed soup, and that's what it really meant. No, that's not what it really meant, and that's why I pointed out earlier in the Jewish prayer book, the traditional prayer book, that even till this day they're praying for the return of the 10 lost tribes, or I would prefer to say the 10 tribes. Now, I guess lastly, one of the things I would want to stress is, hey, look, take a look at the I want to say right, the Muratorian, fragment. Okay, I think that is very important to this discussion, because, as what I stated earlier, the book of Revelation, I believe that it was written before all of Paul's epistles, or at least most of them. And I think we have to recognize that. And I think if that is the case, that should cause us to pause and consider that, if that is the case, that this is the flavor. This is what I'm getting at. If the book of Revelation was written before Paul's epistles, all these believers in Christ as the Messiah, this is what's going through their mind. And if you read the book of Revelation, man, it's like heavy duty Hollywood, never going to touch type movie, because it's wild, and it's not like it's doom and gloom. And yes, at the end, it speaks of restoration and regathering and God's accomplishing what he intended to do. But boy, if the book of Revelation is in the mind and hands of those people that follow Paul, it's going to make a lot more sense, and it's going to help us understand what we're talking about today. So that's one thing I want to, if anyone walks away with anything, I challenge you. One, especially if you're dispensationalist like myself, I think you really need to look at the evidence. The book of Revelation, there's overwhelming evidence, far more than the opposing side, that it's written pre-70 AD. Also, I would even take it farther, that it's written before Paul's epistles. And if that's the case, ladies and gentlemen, then we're going to have a different type of temperature in the room amongst the early Christians, if that is the case amongst those who Paul is writing to. So, Phelan, thank you so much. And Jeremy, I always appreciate you. And it's always a pleasure to always hang out with you guys.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you guys today. Yeah. Let's do it again soon, man.
Definitely.
I mean, I have, I get a lot out of these, and always book suggestions. I always pick up, I read a book that SoCal recommended to me about the Apocrypha.
Really good.
And man, you got me started on the Apocrypha, so I really do appreciate that.
Can I give a plug?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, if you all can too, go to Apocrypha Apocalypse. Check out Gary Machuda's channel. He's a scholar indeed. I really appreciate him, and he's a brother in Christ. And he invited me on his show. Last week. It was a pre-recorded interview that was premiered last night on his channel, and I got to have a conversation with him and William Albright and another gentleman by the name of David from on the other side of the world. But it was a great time of fellowship. I really appreciate it. A lot of things I said in the interview was nothing that I haven't said already in some of my past videos or my debates. It's just more what I hope people see is brothers in Christ coming together and being able to discuss a topic that is to many offensive and dangerous. But I'm rest assured that I will do everything I can to get the Apocrypha back in all Protestant Bibles. And I will do so in such a way that is pleasing to our Lord. And so check out that interview. It was an honor and privilege for me to be on that show with Gary and the other men, William. So it's important to this conversation too. Everything that we're talking about, it's all full circle. So sorry, Phelan. Thank you.
Yeah. Any last words, Jeremy? Any announcements or last words or anything?
I would say you're debating Steve Gregg, right?
Yes, sir. Friday.
Oh, yeah.
I got to start. Getting. It's going to be Friday. Next Friday, it's going to be over at Donnie's channel. I believe it's going to be 6:30 Central, I believe. So it's going to be 7:30 your time. Yeah.
Hey, congrats.
Yeah, that's going to be big.
Great. I'll be looking forward to that. Yeah. You guys both debated Steve Gregg.
Yeah, I'm actually going through some of his previous material now. I'm trying to figure out his position. Well, does he think the millennium started in AD 70? Does he think it started at the cross? I think he thinks it started at the cross. I'm like, that's going to be a good debate.
Get something and grab onto it and just like don't let it go.
I'll tell you what, I was I had gone back to partial preterism, and I read his book trying to debunk full preterism, and that book almost was one of the things that made me go back to full preterism, because
really?
because I felt like he just made so many contradictions in that book, and I still respect the guy. I still think he's a nice guy, but he had really been.
We're not friends.
Well, I mean, he had really been like a mentor to me, where I watched his videos and I really absorbed his stuff, and I thought he did a really good job. And then he wrote that book, and I thought, man, there's some. If you haven't read it, you should check it out, because I did a whole review on my. It was one of the most. I took it down. I'm trying to clean my channel up. Some of the old stuff that I'm not really a fan of anymore. But it was one of my most watched videos of my book review on his full. I forget what it was called.
Why not full preterism?
Why not full preterism? I had a whole series on that, and it really. I think if someone read that and they were on the fence, they would become full preterists. Let's just say
really.
That.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to read that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay,
check out my channel. I got a post debate video on my last debate with Steve. It's definitely
that was a good debate, by the way. Well, we'll do
good.
it again. We'll do it again soon, guys. All right. Well, thanks again. God bless everyone.
God bless everybody. Take care. Good night. See ya.